Dear you, it happens in the most ordinary moment. You're doing something you've done hundreds of times before. Washing your hands, waiting at a red light, scrolling without thinking. And suddenly, a thought cuts through the noise. When was the last time I actually felt here? Not present. In the polite, functional sense. Present in the way that feels alive. The question doesn't panic you. It doesn't scare you. It just lingers. And the longer it stays, the harder it becomes to ignore. You realize you've been moving through your days smoothly, efficiently, almost flawlessly. You wake up, follow routines, respond to what's needed, and go to sleep knowing you completed another day. From the outside, it looks like consistency, stability, even success. But inside, something feels strangely untouched. You're not unhappy. You're not distressed. You're just disconnected. You notice how your reactions feel delayed, like they're happening a half second after the moment passes. You notice how conversations blur together, how weeks disappear without leaving much behind. You're doing everything right, yet it feels like you're watching your life instead of inhabiting it. You tell yourself this is normal, that this is adulthood, that life can't always feel vivid, and still, the feeling persists. A subtle sense that you're operating on default settings, responding out of habit rather than intention. You don't remember deciding to live this way. It just happens slowly, quietly, without asking your permission. What makes this realization unsettling is that there's no clear problem to fix. Nothing is obviously wrong, which means there's nothing you can point to and say, that's it. That's why I feel this way. You keep showing up because you know how to. You keep functioning because you always have, but a quiet question starts forming beneath everything else. Is this really how I want to be living? That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It just waits. It follows you through your routines. It sits beside you in silence. And once you notice it, you can't fully unnotice it. If you're reading this and feeling a slow, familiar tightening in your chest, it's because this experience is widely shared but rarely named. Many people don't fall apart. They drift. They keep moving while gradually losing touch with the part of themselves that chooses, feels, and responds with presence. You didn't choose autopilot because you didn't care. You chose it because it worked. It helped you manage responsibilities. It helped you cope with pressure. It helped you keep going when slowing down wasn't an option. But coping mechanisms, when they become permanent, eventually create distance. This letter isn't here to accuse you of wasting time. It's here to sit with you in the moment you realize something inside you wants to wake up again. To remind you that noticing this disconnection isn't failure. It's awareness. And awareness is where movement begins. Living on autopilot doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you learned how to conserve yourself. At some point, life asked for more than you had the space to fully process. More responsibility, more adaptation, more emotional regulation. So you adjusted not dramatically, but strategically. You streamlined yourself. You learned how to move efficiently from one thing to the next without lingering too long. how to manage emotions quickly so they wouldn't interrupt productivity, how to stay mentally ahead of your schedule instead of grounded in the moment you were actually in. This wasn't avoidance, it was survival. You didn't wake up deciding to disconnect from your life. You gradually prioritized function over feeling. And function kept things running. It kept you reliable. It kept you capable. It helped you meet expectations, your own and others. But presence requires space. And space became scarce. You might have noticed that reflection felt like a luxury, that checking in with yourself felt inefficient, that slowing down created discomfort instead of relief. So you stayed busy, you stayed responsive, you stayed oriented toward the next task. Over time, your inner world learned to stay quiet, not because it disappeared, because it wasn't being invited. You began experiencing life as a series of checklists instead of moments. You completed days rather than inhabiting them. And because you were still functioning well, nothing signaled that something needed attention. Another layer of autopilot comes from expectation. You learned who you were supposed to be: responsible, composed, forward-moving. You internalized a version of yourself that knew how to handle things. And once that version took hold, you kept reinforcing it. You didn't ask whether it still fit. You assumed it had to. Autopilot is efficient, but it's not curious. It doesn't ask what you want. It asks what needs to be done. And when that becomes the dominant mode, your inner life slowly recedes into the background. You may have mistaken this for maturity or discipline or emotional control. And in some ways it was. But control without connection eventually leads to numbness. You're not absent because you don't care. You're absent because you've been managing too much for too long. Understanding this doesn't require judgment. It requires compassion. You adapted in ways that helped you survive demanding seasons. But those adaptations don't have to define the rest of your life. You're not broken, you're buffered, and buffers can be softened. You don't need to dismantle your life to leave autopilot. You don't need to make dramatic changes or sudden decisions. Presence doesn't return through force. It returns through attention, gentle, consistent attention. You can begin by noticing moments instead of rushing past them. The way your body feels when you sit down, the tone of your breath, the subtle reactions you usually override. These aren't exercises. They're reminders. Reminders that you are here, that you're allowed to be here. You don't need to feel intensely to feel present. Presence isn't about excitement or passion. It's about contact. About actually meeting the moment you're in instead of managing it from a distance. You might worry that slowing down will make you fall behind. That presence will interfere with productivity, but presence doesn't stop you from functioning. It changes how you function. It brings intention back into motion. You are allowed to respond instead of react. You are allowed to pause without explanation. You are allowed to feel without immediately labeling or fixing. As you practice this, something subtle shifts. Days stop blurring together quite as much. Moments feel heavier, not in a bad way, but in a grounded way. You start to recognize yourself again. Not as a role or a routine, but as a participant. This isn't a fast process. Some days you'll slip back into autopilot without realizing it. That doesn't mean you failed. It means habit is strong. Each time you notice and return, you strengthen presence. You don't need to wake up all at once. You just need to wake up a little more often. The disconnection you felt wasn't permanent. It was a pause created by necessity. And now, gently, you're stepping back into your own life. Not as someone who needs to catch up, but as someone who is finally arriving. Stay here for a moment. Breathe. Let the day meet you again. You're not late to yourself. Sincerely, you.